So hello, everyone. Welcome to Mary Cale Wilson's Artist in Resident opening talk. I'm Nathan Stanfield. I'm the studio manager at the American Museum of Ceramic Art in Southern California. AMOCA champions the art, history, creation, and technology of ceramics through exhibitions, collections, outreach, and studio programming. Today's artist talk on the work of Mary Cale Wilson, who arrived in April for a short-term residency in the AMOCA Studio. AMOCA's Artist in Resident program was established in 2012, is one of the few long-term fellowship opportunities for ceramic artists on the West Coast. Our residency program, which provides artists an opportunity to produce or develop a new body of work, is funded through generous support from Julianne and David Armstrong, Laguna Clay and Glaze Company, the Windgate and the Windgate Foundation. The next call for residency applications will begin in January of 2025. Sometime end of December might be open. Today, Mary will be sharing some of the work she's completed recently, talk about plans for her time here as an artist in resident at AMOCA. Now I'm excited to tell you a little bit about Mary before we hand it over to Mary. Mary Cale Wilson's sculptures, ceramics, and paintings explore themes of visual culture, memory, and home. She holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in ceramics and art education from the University of Georgia and an MFA in ceramics from San Diego State University. Mary Cale Wilson has participated in prestigious residencies, including the Archie Bray Foundation for Ceramic Arts, where she was a Windgate Scholar, and a winter resident at the Penland School of Craft. In recognition of her work, she was named a Ceramics Monthly Emerging Artist in 2019. Wilson's work has been showcased extensively with exhibitions at venues such as the Clay Studio of Philadelphia, here at the American Museum of Ceramic Art, and the California Center for the Arts. Notably, her pieces have been featured in the 76th Scripps Ceramics Annual, as well as the 2020 and 2023 NCECA Annuals. Mary Cale shares her love of clay as a ceramics instructor at the San Diego State University. Wilson will be in residence at AMOCA through August of 2024. So before Mary starts her presentation, I just want to remind everyone that this is being recorded. It'll be released at a later date. There will be an opportunity also at the end for Q&A. So now I will turn the presentation over to Mary. Thanks.
Thank you, Nathan. That was a lovely introduction. I'm going to share my screen and get started. Let's see if I remember how to do this. Okay. Does that look okay, Nathan?
Yes, wonderful.
Great. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And it's really quite not just an honor, but a time that I'm really grateful for being here as a resident. It's really a gift is the word I'm looking for, a gift to be here, a blessing to be here. I wanted to thank Nathan in particular, as well as the rest of the staff and Beth Ann for having me. This came at a great time for me being a resident, and you've made my time here as easy as can be and as rewarding as possible. I'd also like to thank all my new studio friends. There's so many wonderful resident artists, Luke and Paige, and all the other studio members have just been really a lot of fun to get to know. And thank you for continually feeding me, giving me all the snacks, and just the warm welcome. So as Nathan mentioned, my name is Mary Cale Wilson. I go by Mary Cale. I have a good old Southern double name, and actually my mother just logged in. So that's who I am. I live in San Diego, and I teach at San Diego State University. Today's talk is going to be largely about my work starting around like 2019. I'll touch a little bit on some work prior to that, and a little bit about my background, but really a lot about what I'm thinking about in the studio, what I'm working on now, and how I think about source material in my practice. So as Nathan mentioned, I have a BFA in studio art, in ceramics, as well as a BFA in art education from the University of Georgia. And after I got my BFA, I taught high school art in southeastern rural Georgia for about 7 years. After that, I moved to San Diego to pursue my MFA in ceramics, and that was a really big move for me. Luckily, when I finished school there, I was able to stay on and teach, and I've been teaching ceramics there ever since. Sorry, I have one of those fancy mouses that I'm like, there's no button. Okay, I figured it out. So ceramics is my primary medium. Obviously, we're at the American Museum of Ceramic Art, but I also do work in two-dimensional traditional media like drawing and painting. Sometimes I work between the two at once and absolutely divorce the two from each other. And sometimes the ceramic object becomes a canvas for my work. Currently, I've really been focused more on form, but I do have a love of pattern, a love of color, a love of domestic imagery. You'll see that ties through and has been a part of my work. It started showing up when I was in undergrad 2 decades ago. And so that source material has always been a question for me. Why am I drawn to this? What is it about the domestic image? What is it about the home? What is it about pattern that I really love? Sorry, I really am struggling with this mouse here. Okay. So my work is highly influenced by family heirlooms, the idea of collectibles, the idea of like on the top left, we have images of a lot of our family heirlooms, family silver, family porcelain, things people were given as wedding gifts that passed down from generation to generation, some of which I've inherited. On the top right, my grandmother collected eggs, collects eggs. And so like this idea of these ceramic objects or glass objects that would be around the home that means something to someone, that are sort of a lifelong investment, and that you see as highly valuable. I'm also looking a lot at European porcelain. That's something that I really just enjoy. I love to look at archives like the Victoria and Albert Museum. I also love to watch like Downton Abbey, and I watch for the back. That's a great way to watch for really beautiful European porcelain. And then the idea of the home, as I mentioned. So growing up, I'm from southeastern Georgia, just outside of Savannah. I grew up in a very rural community, just outside of the city. And so there was a lot of history around me. My grandmother owned a Victorian home as well. And so these spaces, these objects, the furniture, the ceramics, all of that is something that is influential to my work. And it all becomes a way for me to investigate that idea of who I am and where I'm from. And whether that is a deep dive or is a more playful exploration, those ideas of these objects and these spaces tie through. And really not only reflect my interests now, but reflect like my memories of these spaces and being a child in those spaces. I also really love 1950s, 60s kitsch. So things like Jello molds and old Tupperware. And Mom, I remember selling this at a yard sale with you, like the old cabbage bowl that some great aunt painted when she did ceramics as a hobby. I love the way that these things are also beautiful to me and remind me of home. And when I start to kind of pair these with those more refined sort of highbrow objects like the antiques and the European porcelain, I'm able to really play with dualities. And at its root, both visually and in my thinking, I'm really interested in duality and the pairing of things like high and low, sort of fancy and casual, adult and childlike. So when I was in grad school, all of this was something I was already using as visual imagery. And so I started to dive really deep into how I could use that to talk about memory. And some of the pieces that came out in my last year in my thesis exhibition, which was titled Dredge. I'm just going to show a couple of these. This work was really about diving deep into that visual imagery as a way to talk about being a Southerner and all of that history and memory. This is a piece that utilized, I started getting my hands on these old hobby molds at this point. I'll talk more about those, and thinking about objects that had been collected but neglected, and this sort of relationship back and forth. This piece is one of the larger pieces I've made as well, and this is about 4 foot tall. A couple other pieces from my thesis exhibition. I wanted to use, as I mentioned, that image of the heirloom quality object. So on the left, this is my grandmother's silver coffee pot, which my mother now has. I think there's actually 2. And I wanted to use that as a way to show the other aspects of my heritage. So I showed that against a field, and I was thinking about our history of agriculture and also our history of privilege that comes with this sort of object, and even thinking even more deeply about history of using enslaved labor. And so this work, I'm not going to talk as much about today, but I did want to mention it. And it's really rooted the work I'm making now. And the work I'm making now is not as much of a deep dive into that more topical exploration of Southern identity. But I think the imagery and the sentiment of home and of building a vocabulary around these objects is still carrying through. And if you are more interested, this is another piece from that body of work on the left. I was really also using a lot of food imagery, and you can see the love of pattern, the love of color, and the love of domestic imagery coming through. I am on Ben Carter's podcast, Tales of a Red Clay Rambler, and he's also from the South. So we take a deep dive into this topic and this body of work in that interview. So if you're interested in that, please do listen to it. Another body of work that I've worked on here and there, kind of started during grad school, that I've continued to play with, also exploring duality, is this body of work called Foul Foul. And I really enjoy wordplay there. The idea of using something really like fancy and classic, and something that would be like a power symbol or a symbol of class, like the European porcelain. I wanted to play with that and not only activate it with these birds, but to use the birds as like a form of questioning or a form of rebellion against those. So thinking about also the birds as collectibles. So you can see on the top or the bottom right, like I was thinking about bird figurines like this, and what if they were sort of like activated and came to life, which is silly and also very playful. Play is a really important aspect of my work that carries through, and it's sort of an approach that I bring to the objects that I make. You can see the top right are the objects, the little figurines I've gotten my hands on, a bunch of old collectible kitsch molds, and I've been casting those. So those get added to the coil built form, which you can see on the left. So I'm sort of combining all of this visual imagery that I'm interested in as a way to sort of play against each other. And there they are. So in 2019, I was accepted to do a summer residency at the Archie Bray Foundation in Helena, Montana. And you know, looking at what I'd been making, I really was excited about, you know, about this maybe a year or so out of grad school, really trying something different while I was at the Bray. And I had begun to explore a little bit more quiet forms, and thinking a bit more just about the decorative itself and what it might look like to develop my own heirloom. What would it look like to, instead of looking back and showing the heirlooms I've inherited, what might it look like if I created something on my own? So I started to develop these pieces. I worked on this for about a year, starting at the Bray and then coming back to my studio in San Diego. And these are basically functional urns with cast and manipulated flower elements. So thinking about that 3D pattern, the wallpaper you saw in some of the earlier work, thinking about that pattern and how it could become three-dimensional. And I never intended the work to be necessarily without color, but it seemed to be, as I developed this work, that the quiet use of just pattern and form was enough. And so this work, I kind of think of this balance between maximalism and minimalism. And I think I've sort of fit right between. And so these are coil built. And what I do is I've made some slip casting molds. I will cast simple shapes actually, and then like cones and such, and then cut them open and assemble these flowers that are attached on. And these are porcelain. They're actually kind of like almost high fire, cone 8, which was fun to do because I'm usually working in earthenware. It was fun to do something a little bit different while I was there. And I was to show you what I was looking at in particular and thinking about as the work develops. Sometimes when I'm developing work, it's like realizing as I build what it's reminding me of, and then going back and looking at those and then kind of coming back to work. So there's this, this idea, and I know there's some students here that are listening on, some young students, that we can set up inspiration or influence for ourselves, source we're looking at, but as we make work, it might reveal to us what we want to look at a little bit more. And so as I started the work, it reminded me of this Meissen potpourri pot. These are just, to me, over the top. And I had seen these years ago and they had just stayed with me as like almost, they're sort of gaudy, but they're also really wonderful. And so I was thinking about those, and I was also thinking about chenille blankets, which I had a chenille blanket on my bed, I think when I was in high school. But that really reminded me of home and that sort of use of pattern, but in a monochromatic way. It was all about form and texture. And then on the bottom left, these are flour sackcloths. So I would often hear either, not necessarily in our family, but friends talking about like their grandmother's flour sackcloth dresses. So that these were fabrics people would get their hands on, or seed bags that looked like this, and then they'd make clothing out of them. But they're really very graphic patterns. And so thinking about that kind of simple repetition. And I was also thinking about garniture. I didn't know the word garniture, but at the time, so I give my friend Naomi Clement credit for teaching me about garniture, but I was familiar with the idea of like objects that would be on top of a mantelpiece. And so I was also thinking about that and that really wonderful symmetry that comes from this arrangement of objects. So you can see some of the forms that I created while I was at the Bray on the right, and then some garniture that I was looking at on the left. While I was at the Bray, I had, prior to that, developed this love of earthenware while I was in grad school, true low fire earthenware. I love the terracotta aspect of it that evokes to me like a flower pot in the backyard and bricks on a house. And so I kept my bag of earthenware kind of tucked in the corner. I didn't want it to get mixed into my porcelain. And this was a piece that I made that never made it back. That's, you know, when we think about the value of play and experimentation and even failure in the studio or in life, this is a piece that really did a lot for me because I discovered some things I really liked. I think the handle broke and I just like stuck it back together, but I took a picture of it because I thought there were some interesting things happening, kind of coming from that pattern work back into the red clay. I had collected, as I mentioned, these hobby molds. So I was playing with these little floral like sprigs that I don't know what they were for, but I was taking them out of context from their original hobby purpose and making something new. And so this really triggered what I made after that. So this is kind of transitioning to the more current body of work, which is an earthenware interpretation of those porcelain forms in many ways and combines all of these old parts, these casts of domestic objects, these found hobby molds to make something new. So this idea of almost revision or making something out of the past. And although, you know, it's not work that's about any particular point in history, but this idea of how we can look at something that exists, I think both as a lesson in culture or in history, but also in life, and rearrange something to make something new. I think that's a really fun way to work. And I think it really reflects a lot of things about my perspective on the world. And so I really liked to use this vocabulary of molds that I've developed and try to create something. I was looking at images like this. So garniture on the left, but more of these Meissen porcelain forms on the right. This was actually an image of my inspiration wall in my studio at the time. So I tend to like set up a wall of images that allow me to kind of filter through them. So I like this idea that as an artist, I'm sort of like a funnel and a filter. So everything we're looking at, thinking about, experiencing, kind of coming through my mind and my eyes and then coming out through my hands. So little moments from different things might filter through the use of flowers, the use of form, sometimes really sitting down and trying to engineer something to work, you know, thinking about, let's say, the way a pedestal transitions to the body of a pot might be really fun to think about and then try to say, okay, what do I have in my vocabulary of molds that might work? Or what do I need to build that might work in terms of this proportion? So one of my neighbors in the studio here keeps referring to me as an engineer, and my father's actually an engineer. So I do think a bit about that too, about like organizing and building something and trying to engineer something to work. But these are the molds I keep talking about. So some of these are old flower pot molds. On the top right, these little flower molds that I've been using for ages that I've actually started to have to learn to make molds of the molds because they're wearing out. So if anybody, shout out, if anybody has any old molds that they're not using, I'm your girl. I also tend to make molds of domestic objects, like on the bottom right, you can see an image of a mold I was making of some little food tins. Anything that sort of seems domestic, but also is just interesting form. I think at the end of the day, it has to be interesting to me, and it has to be so simple that it could be a stand-in for just a form or a transition within a larger object. So continuing to play with that, I was also looking at these Dutch tulipiers, which some of you I'm sure know about these forms. They were really objects that were all about power and class and wealth, and they were developed in during the craze where tulips were more valuable than gold in the Netherlands, I believe. And so I wanted to, this is another form I was just sort of reinterpreting in my own way. I had a lot of fun with these. I even made one that would hold hot dogs. That was, I just started thinking like, what, I don't know, this is silly, but thinking about what, what else those forms could be. If we're thinking about reinterpreting a historical form, like what do they look like in everyday life? And I don't know about you, but I ate a lot of hot dogs growing up. And so this was another way to think about that, that duality that I enjoy both in work, the work that I make, but also to me, that duality reflects the way I was raised and the culture I grew up in. And so there's always this wonderful way that art can reflect in different ways, nuances about our lives or our culture or the things that we're thinking about and bringing to our work. So if it's hot dogs, it's hot dogs. But I also started playing with candelabras, had many fail, but this is one of them. This is actually in the show here, Fahrenheit. And having a lot of fun with that. I made a chandelier out of that same approach to working. This was actually created, I was invited to be in a show. It was all women artists working in parts. So the idea of like parts becoming a whole, and that was something I was already doing. And I wanted to make a hanging sculpture and a chandelier. And so this was really fun. I think I honestly worked on this for years because I would experiment with something and then I would step away from it and do something else and come back. So I would love to make another one of these. This was, you can see some of the food molds, like the little Tupperware. Some of these are little casts of like Tupperware containers or food molds. You can see the same flower motif on the body of the chandelier. And I also started playing with paper clay. So I was interested in how I could create this to be lighter in weight. I didn't want to either pay to ship something across the country that weighed a lot, nor did I want to create like an engineering problem where it was too heavy to be hung from a standard ceiling. So by adding paper, for those, I know we have many artists here, but some people who are not artists, by adding the paper to the clay, when you fire it, it burns away. So there's like these air pockets that are left. So you have a reduced weight to the overall object. So this is really what I'm thinking about now. I've been thinking a lot about, I was thinking about the candelabra and the tulipier, but I'm really more interested in actual space. So I started to think about things in the home that are sort of even overlooked, or they're markers of a space. You don't just move the chandelier. And so they, to me, are really interesting forms. They take up a lot of space. They're really dynamic. They can be quite interesting, but they, and by making my own, I'm bringing my own vocabulary to this, but I'm also still playing with almost an archetype of a chandelier. Sort of even the idea of like something traditional or something classic. And of course, in reference to my own culture and upbringing. And then this is rug. What I'm working on now is another version of this. This measures about 3.5 by 5.5 feet and is all earthenware tile. That's 3-dimensional. And again, I was using the hobby molds that I found, molds that I've made, some of which were, I came across dollhouse parts at this point, and I made a bunch of molds of dollhouse molding like you would buy to put up in your tiny little living room that you made in your dollhouse. And I thinking about the chandelier, I thought, okay, what's maybe the equivalent on the floor? And I had a lot of fun making this piece. The idea of this, like this very symmetrical pattern evolving as you build it is really, it's actually quite challenging. And thinking about how actually when you start investigating rug design, like there's a lot of really seemingly random things that happen within these motifs. So it's interesting in terms of, I'd been interested in pattern before, but the pattern was often repeated pattern. And in this case, the pattern, the motif is sometimes just a moment where one thing is happening, but then it happens again. So it sort of makes sense. It's almost a whole different way of thinking. And so when I'm making this, I am looking at rug patterns and then reinterpreting it in my own way. So again, this idea of like the whole and the part being very meaningful to me. And I love the idea of taking up space without having to make something giant that has to go in the kiln as a huge unit. It's a much more approachable way to work for me. This is the piece while it was being built. I really love the color of the clay. It's chocolatey. Another project I worked on this year that was an evolution of this way of working in parts. I did a residency at the New Children's Museum, which is a wonderful museum in San Diego that is all designed for children, and it's all built around the idea of play. But when you go and visit, if you speak to a member of their staff, they'll tell you that it's primarily a contemporary art space, and secondary it's for children. And so I was invited to do a project for them where I would develop a piece of curriculum or a project for the children to engage in that was related to my work. So I'd been thinking so much about parts and the whole that I thought it would be great to make something that utilized that approach. And having worked with children, having worked with teenagers, having an awareness of all those different levels of ability, I thought that a bead could be something that anybody could walk in and make. Even a child who had limited, say, mobility could squeeze a ball of clay. So we made beads. You can see my samples in the middle, and then the beads on the bottom right that the children made. So they made beads for about a month. Most of the beads that were made went home with the children, because if you've ever worked with kids, if they like what they made, they do not want to give it to you. But we did manage to collect enough to paint them and assemble them and hung them up. And so it actually looks kind of small in the picture. It's a really large space. So we made this giant hanging sculpture that we, in the end, decided looked a bit like a candy necklace or a friendship bracelet. And once we realized it was looking like that, with all the Taylor Swift, like the kids love Taylor Swift. They were all obsessed with the idea of the friendship bracelet. So that was really cool. As soon as we started telling the kids that they could make a bead for our friendship bracelet, they really loved that. So that was something really cool that I did this year. And then I came to AMOCA in April, and this is my studio when I got started. It is now covered in red clay. And I jumped right in. I was finishing out the semester at San Diego State, so I was up, for a few days, and then I'd go back and teach for a couple of days and come back up. So I knew that working on another rug, which is something I'd wanted to do for a while, was a great way to start, because it would, if parts of it dried out, it wouldn't be ruined. So I started to draw these. This is the drawing that I decided on. When I draw these, I'm looking at a rug that I find online, and I don't know how it's going to translate into my vocabulary of molds and into essentially what the clay is going to do in my hands. But if I have I actually don't even want a complete plan, but if I have kind of a guideline of what needs to happen within the motif in terms of movement and repetition and pattern, then I can fill in as I go. So each piece of the rug is about just over 7.5 by 7.5, rolled on the slab roller. And then I interpret that form with my own vocabulary of molds. So you can see the tiles piling up here. I think this particular rug is going to be, let's see, 5 by 6, 5 by 7. It's bigger than the last one is the point. And more tiles. I think it's 116 tiles in the end. And it can go either on the floor or the wall. That was an idea one of my fellow residents gave me, Paige, was to make it hangable on the wall as well. So these are the molds on the left that I'm using. And what's fun about it, what I realized just the other day is that some of the flowers that I'm creating are made out of other things, and sometimes the flowers are flowers. So I'm still trying to resolve that in my mind, if that makes sense or not to me, but it is what's happening. And of course, each tile there's 4 of, and they you know, mirror each other. So there's a bit of sometimes like a big commitment to something. You know, if you have to make something 4 times, it's a bit of patience and labor, but I'm really enjoying that sort of, as challenging as it is and as much as it forces me to be patient and to show up and to make the thing. It's also really nice to have sort of that meditative quality of repetitive work happening. So these are the centerpieces on the long sides. I started with the edge. Here's the back. Oh, and I did write on my notes, it's going to be around 6 by 8. I've been carving the back so they can be hung. You can't really see it, but there's an undercut there. So in terms of the engineering of how this works, I always like to hear people talk about those aspects of their work and how they're thinking about the user, how this thing is going to exist later for somebody, especially when you make something this large. You have to obviously think about it. How is this actually going to work? This is the border. This is the table. So anybody who's been in the studio, these are the large tables. So you can see this is actually bigger than the table. That's the complete border on the right, but it doesn't fit on the table. So I've got the border done, and now I'm working on the centerpiece. This is something I just finished yesterday, I think. And now, so the center motif is going to kind of flow from one. It'll be more of a connected pattern. So the parts will be a bit more unified between the parts. And I really love that. I was looking back at the old rug to sort of see, now that I'm making a new one, what do I really like about the old one that I want to make sure I don't leave out? Because as an artist, especially when we revisit an idea, we often like leave out what we didn't like and focus on what we do like that's happening. And so I was looking back, and what I really loved was where the pattern flowed across that line. And it doesn't always line up. And even that is okay. It's not perfect. But I am, when you make a piece that has 116 tiles, sometimes by tile 60, you wish you could redo tile 1. And so there's this relationship to almost like, as an artist, every time we show up to the studio, we're a little different. We've learned something from the previous tile. So by the middle of this piece, I will have, I'm sure, complete perspective and resolve on exactly how the first part should have gone. But I'm enjoying that sort of, it's interesting as artists, we want everything to be perfect. But it isn't always. And so just kind of keeping that commitment to the work and to a large project. Hopefully I will finish this sooner than later. And my goal is next I want to go back to some large vessels and think about how some of these motifs might wrap around like a classical vessel. This particular flower looks like one of those badminton things a little bit. So I'm trying to figure out if that's okay. But that's where I am in the studio. And thank you again, AMOCA, for having me. Thank you guys for all being here. And if I can click on my last slide, there we go. There's my Instagram and my website. I'm really actually getting to the point where I'm interested in working with designers, trying to find spaces for these objects to live where they make sense, these compositions. So that's where I am as an artist. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary. Yeah, so now we got time for some questions. So please feel free to either like type your question in the chat and I'll read it and we can go through it, or use the little raised hand emoji and then we can unmute you. So give it a couple seconds. I'm sure something will clock in. Let's see. All right. So first one from Mimi. Can you talk a little more about how these pieces hang or will hang? You mentioned an undercut. Is that done with a template?
Yeah, I can talk about that. Let's see, I just have a square and I measure the square on the back on, so ideally they're very similar. They're not going to be, this is still not going to be easy to hang because the tiles aren't perfect. If they were made out of wood, they would be, but they're clay, so they're going to warp, but they're ideally, it's the same. I marked the same square on the back. I decided to do a square because I thought it would be nice if they could hang in any direction. And then I carved down into it. And then on this side that, if you think about like it going onto the wall like this, on the side that would be on the top, I've got a little carving tool. I'm just carving up into that edge so that a screw, so there's enough space the screw could go in and it would slide down. It's what I came up with. I think it's pretty good. Paige helped me with it. Thank you, Paige.
All right, so it looks like Carly's got their hand raised. Okay.
Oh, I was unmuted. Sorry. I hope I wasn't one of the unmuted people.
No, you're good.
Sorry.
Hey, Carly.
Hey, how's it? Yeah, we have so much to talk about after this. Tulip Pierre's my favorite form. My cat's about to go for a run. I'm sorry. There's a cat wheel behind me. And I've been looking for some vintage molds lately, so I'm deep in vintage mold land, so I'll hook you up with some places to look. But would you ever make a real rug? Not that your rug's not real, but like a traditional woven rug. Would you ever move? Oh,
that'd be great. But then I think that there's this idea of translation, material translation, that's really interesting. So I feel like I would have to, like, I would want the rug, I don't know, maybe the rug needs to look like ceramics or something, you know, maybe it needs to be like blue and white. I don't know.
yeah.
All right, thank you. So then we got another one from Diana. When you create the coil around the side of the rug, do you cross over the tiles and cut them, or do you do them individually?
That's a great question, Diana. Diana, I do them individually. I have I meant to either bring it to show you or put a picture of it. What I did is I ended up creating like a scale drawing. And what that means is that I have a template that I trace when I make like the 4 of one type. And that's for 2 reasons. One, so that they're similar. They're not perfectly the same, but they're similar. And number 2, if one breaks later, I know how to remake it, because with shrinkage, things are going to be a little bit different. So I actually learned that from Kathy King years ago. She was talking about a project she had made where she had made templates and was really glad because something had to be redone. So yeah, so I have like a master.
Smart, very clever. Next question from Georgie. Why did you gravitate towards earthenware as your clay of choice? Does it have to do more about the materiality or maybe a theme in your work?
Good question. By the way, these are all my former students that are grilling me. I love it. Georgie, okay, so the earthenware, when I started using it, I was doing a lot years ago. I was doing a lot of like screen printing on clay and drawing, and I actually had been using white clay because I thought of it as paper. So the red clay kind of warmed things up. And then it did remind me of a brick or a terracotta pot, which to me referenced home, referenced a domestic space in a really nice way. I also really liked, since so much of my visual like source material is from the interior of the home, that's something from the exterior, thinking about duality was there, like the inside outside. I also think it's just like really humble. There's something about the red clay that kind of brings it down to earth. And then I have found in time that if I'm not going to glaze or use underglaze on a piece, I like for the clay to speak to me, yet to have a beautiful color on its own. So either like a porcelain, I've even played a little bit with colored porcelain. But the earthenware just does that to me. I found a couple bodies that are just really beautiful on their own. They kind of vitrify low enough that they kind of have they're pretty tight, if that makes sense from a kind of technical standpoint. So visually they feel pretty resolved.
All right. Any more questions before we wrap up? Got one hand over here. Oh, that was Georgie's question. All right, I'll call it then. So thank you all for joining us and for your excellent questions. For more of Mary Cale's work, you can visit their website at marycale.com, which will be dropped into the chat box here. If you're in the neighborhood, come visit the museum and ceramics studio in Pomona, California. You can learn more about AMOCA, our ceramics studio, our residency program, and all of our exhibitions on our website at amoca.org. And a reminder, a recording of this presentation will be available on our website in the coming weeks. So thank you again and see you soon. Thank you so much, Mary.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming, everybody.